So good afternoon and welcome to the March Power Hour, and it's on local government pension schemes today. Before we begin, there are a couple of housekeeping points. So Ross, if you could move it on a little bit, please. So please remain off camera and on mute throughout the session. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation where we can answer as many questions as we can. Please put your questions into the chat, or any that you think most pertinent to you, put a like next to them, and we'll try and collate all the most liked questions at the end. We might not be able to answer all your questions, and we can pop into the chat the Academy questions if you've got anything specific to a trust. The session is going to be recorded and it will be shared along with the slides. So I'll now pass you over to Jamie Callahan.
Thanks, Julie. Welcome, everyone. Really good to be here today. I've heard rumour this is the most popular ever Power Hour we've done, so who knew pensions were so popular? Just a quick introduction to our presenters today. So myself, Jamie Callahan, I work in ESFA along with Jenny and Ross. I'm the head of the LGPS operational policy team. Myself, Jenny and Ross are all here today, but Jenny's got a bit of a cough, so she won't be on camera today speaking, so it'll be Ross and myself, but Jenny will be in the chat to help us answer the questions. And a very warm welcome as well to Charity Main and Richard Lane, who are two of our Academy representatives. Charity is the Chief Operating Officer at Anglian Learning Academy Trust, and Richard is the Director of Finance and Operations at Twyford Church of England Academies Trust. So we're going to do some presenting on our side from the ESFA's point of view, and then Charity and Richard have also got a couple of sections from a sector perspective, and then we'll talk to you as well about how we work and intend to work as two different parts of the sector as well. So quickly to run through what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to have, as I say, a bit of a section from ourselves in ESFA about LGPS, a bit of a recap what exactly it is, how the academies operate within the scheme, talk a little bit about the guarantee that DFE has in place for Academy Trust and what that means for academies. We're going to focus on some of the issues we know that some Academy Trusts face in terms of outsourcing and the challenges that presents to them, and Charity's going to help us just to give us some perspective from her own experiences there, and then a bit of an update what we're looking at and what we intend to do there. As I said, Charity and Richard are going to talk to you about the work that they do as representatives of the academy sector on the LGPS Scheme Advisory Board and the working groups they sit on, and the work they're doing there. And then we'll talk about how our respective teams and Charity and Richard and sector representatives work together, and then have a look at different aspects of the working group, what we're seeking to do, and the current environment in terms of the scheme and LGPS. And then, as Julie says, we've got a Q&A section at the end, so hopefully we'll pick up as many questions as we can, either in the chat or we'll discuss those at the end. We thought we'd kick off with a poll to start with. As I'm sure you're all aware, LGPS is just finalising its triennial valuation. So I'm sure you've all been informed, as it's a legal requirement for funds to set the contribution rates by the 31st of March. But just quite interested from your perspective how that's affecting your contribution rates for your academies or academy trusts. So the poll is very quickly just look at whether that has increased your rates, they're staying about the same, decreasing, or you don't know yet. If you can just happily vote, and we'll see what comes of that. So I intend to do my best horse racing commentary impression here, but it looks like it's quite even Stevens at the moment. Interestingly, slightly ahead, an increase in contribution rates, but not too far behind a decrease, which is quite positive, and about the same, slightly less, are staying the same. It would certainly be exciting if it was a horse race, because everyone's in with the show at the moment. But yeah, so it looks like slight majority have seen an increase in those rates. I'm sure we can touch on that in the Q&A about what that means for you and your academies.
Okay, I'll move on now while that poll's going in the background. We'll just talk quickly about LGPS and the DFE Academy Guarantee. So first of all, academies and the LGPS. So just a rough summary. So local government pension scheme is a public sector statutory defined benefit funded pension scheme. All academy trusts are legally obliged to offer access to the LGPS for all of their non-teaching employees, so long as they remain employed by the academy trust. So most academy schools will be a member of a fund from local authority. There are 77 funds in total in England. Across those 77 funds, there are 4 scheme actuaries that cover them. So they are Aon, Mercer, Barnett Waddingham and Hyman Robertson, as you can see in the bottom right there of the slide. So funds have autonomy in setting their funding strategy, which results in different policies and procedures being applied to academies depending on which fund they participate in. And the funding strategy statement sets the parameters for which the fund will apply for. So we have included in that employer contribution rates, funding requirements on employer admissions and cessations, as well as actuarial factors for valuing bulk transfers and early retirement costs. So employer contribution rates are specific to employers and are set revised following a triennial valuation, so every 3 years. And then just moving on a bit about the funding, I'm going to pass over to Jamie quickly to talk about this.
Yeah, we thought it'd be just worthwhile just dwelling on exactly what LGPS is, because we get quite a few questions from academy trusts along the lines of why do each of our academies have different rates? Why are they different across the country? Why can't we have a single rate, a bit like the teachers' pension scheme? So just worth reflecting on the differences between LGPS and TPS first of all. As Ross said, the local pension scheme is a statutory defined benefit pension scheme, very similar to TPS. But whereas TPS is an unfunded scheme, i.e. there's no fund that sits behind the fund, each of the funds, the 77 funds in the LGPS, is a funded scheme, so there's money invested there. So that means that there's 2 inputs, if you like, to the rate of the deficit. So there's the employee or the contributions, that's made up of the employee contributions, which are fairly stable, and then 2 different elements to the employer scheme: the primary contribution rate, which feeds into the ongoing cost of pensions, and then the secondary contribution rate, which takes care of any deficit that exists within that particular fund for that particular employer. And then separately, which is unlike the teachers' pension scheme, there is a fund that the money is invested in, so returns on those investments can impact. So there's 2 different factors that affect the contributions in terms of the fund itself and the assets or liabilities that may exist in the fund. So that's both the return on those investments, but also the contribution rates coming in, whereas TPS is just the contribution rates for the employee and employers, and any shortfall is that is essentially made up by the exchequer in an unfunded scheme.
Okay, so I'll talk briefly now about the DFE Academy LGPS guarantee, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So the guarantee was introduced in 2013 following increased employer contribution rates for schools when converting to an academy. So the DFE provides funding for unpaid pension liabilities upon academy trust closure, and that's if the academy trust closes with insufficient reserves to pay any pension liability. So essentially we're covering the pension cost for the sector if there are any trust closures. So this provides reassurance to pension funds that there will be no shortfall in funding should an academy trust close, which therefore allows pension funds to treat academies on par with local authority maintained schools, and therefore reduce the risk profile and the amount of employer contributions they have to make. So we estimate by reducing these employer contributions that the guarantee saves the academy sector roughly £30 million per year. And then in 2022, we identified an opportunity to recommit to the guarantee to ensure that pension funds are actually recognising it as we'd expect them to, and therefore treating academy trust appropriately. So in 2022, we conducted a review, and then the Secretary of State for Education wrote to all LGPS pension fund managers in England. The letter that she wrote provided the guarantee expect pension funds to ensure that is reflected in the scheme valuation and funding strategy statements, both in the setting of employer contribution rates and the length of the deficit recovery period. And within our guarantee, we also have outsourcing policy, which I'm going to pass over to Jamie to discuss now.
Thanks, Ross. Yeah, so this is a particular area that we identify as part of our casework, with lots of academies coming through the inquiry service to raise questions about outsourcing. So that being where an academy trust outsources some of its provision in terms of back office functions, for example, cleaning or catering. And the questions revolve around, does the DFE guarantee cover those outsourced services? So as part of that work, we identified that there was a bit of a gap in what was covered and what wasn't covered. So there's essentially three groups of employees that you can see on the slide there. So anyone that's previously been employed by the Academy Trust was covered by the guarantee. And it was a case of confirming that, which is fine. But I think in terms of when the guarantee first came in 2013, the landscape's changed. I don't think the policy at the time conceived there would be a group of individuals that previously worked for local authorities that had already been outsourced. When that academy converted to academy status, the Academy Trust became the employer for those, the contracting authority for those. So as they hadn't previously worked for the Academy Trust, they weren't covered by the guarantee, and that was causing issues. And we know this is causing issues for Academy Trust in terms of the arrangements in terms of pension funds asking for bonds, the additional contract work, the legal work, and the time it's taking for colleagues within the sector to work through that. So there's two groups there which we know haven't been that aren't currently covered, and one that is covered. And I'm just going to pass over to Charity now to, I think, put more of a contextual spin on what this actually means and the challenges this provides, and we know provides to the sector. And then I can come back and talk about what we're looking at doing for this. So I'll pass to Charity now.
Thank you, Jamie. So if I just give a little bit of our context, so Anglian Learning is a trust, as the name suggests, in the east of England, predominantly located around Cambridge, and we've grown very significantly in the last 3 years. So we've basically doubled in size since December 2019. We were 7 schools at that point, and we are 15 schools now, educating somewhere around 8,000 pupils. Kind of as a result of that growth, and as a result really of the fact that the pandemic kind of delayed some of the work that we wanted to do, last year we moved our catering into a single contract. So we moved from 5 separate contracts and some in-house provision into a single contract, and that was really around being better able to monitor catering and to get the advantages that come from a larger contract in terms of sharing staff across schools to cope with sickness and absence and those sorts of things. It was clearly a big cultural piece of work to combine everybody together in a single contract, and was the biggest actual piece of contracting work that we've done as an organisation. And actually, just reflecting what Jamie said, pensions were a significant part of that complexity. So we actually had the left-hand side of that slide. We had people in all those different groups, and that made it very complex to administer. We had pension administrators saying to us, well, you can have pass-through for some people. So pass-throughs are generally the administratively easier option and easier to set up, but saying, no, you'll have to have a pension bond for other employees. And it was often actually quite a small group, a handful of employees. The other thing about needing to go down the bond route is that it's much more expensive. Pension funds will often ask you for pre-work, and that pre-work often is about a group of employees that might not even be the group of employees that you finally end up transferring, in terms of the fact that people leave and so on. So I think really, just to give my perspective as somebody in the sector, if we can get this resolved, it will kind of have a sort of threefold advantage, or 3 advantages if you like. So there's just the saving in staff time in terms of managing those contracting processes and dealing with pension administrators, often across a number of funds. Reducing the cost of actuarial work, and then just in the direct costs of the contract, in terms of if you don't require a pension bond, then that will tend to make the contract cheaper as well.
Thanks, Charity. I think that's really good, because I could talk or try and talk all day about these issues, but I think it's really good to get a perspective of someone actually working in these and the challenges that provides for the sector. And I think we've certainly identified it, and we hear the challenges that the sector faces. And I think in everything we do, we're seeking to make it easier and more simple for Academy Trust to operate with LGPS in terms of what we can do. We were hoping to make an announcement today, or highlight an announcement, but time has escaped us on this, because any changes we make to the guarantee have to be laid before Parliament, and we're now in recess, or very shortly in recess, in terms of Easter. So I'm going to tread very carefully about not finding myself in contempt of Parliament by announcing something I shouldn't do. But I would just say watch this space, because we're going to hopefully make an announcement shortly after Easter around what we're going to do here, and hopefully that'll be well received by the academy sector to make your lives easier and cheaper. Because I think, as I say, in everything we do, what we don't want is money being unnecessarily spent to service pensions when they could be used in the classroom. I think ourselves, and with Charity and our sector representatives, to work towards that end, so we can maximise the public money we use to teach children, rather than doing something that's unnecessary. So I think we're going to pass over to Charity and Richard now to have a bit of a session on their input into sector representation, and their work with the Scheme Advisory Board.
Thank you, Jamie. So I think it's me first. So just to really outline the role that Richard and I have. So Richard and I were appointed as Academy representatives to two subcommittees of the LGPS Scheme Advisory Board, starting in September 2022. So we've only actually been in the role for a relatively short period. And this is important as we are a significant sector in LGPS, and clearly a growing sector in LGPS. And although we share lots of the same challenges with pensions that local government does, we also have some issues that are different and are unique to the sector. And until now, our voice hasn't really been formally heard, or our opinions sought. And just to say that the Scheme Advisory Board is actually administered by the Local Government Association, so it's actually administered by the body that represents local councils. So what this has enabled us to do is given us a really good opportunity to work with a wide group of stakeholders, and there's a little summary on the slide of the sorts of people that participate in the Scheme Advisory Board. In terms of my subcommittee, so I'm the Academy representative on Cost Management, Benefit Design and Administration Committee. And just to sort of summarise what that committee's been working on or been talking about since I joined. So some of the work's technical and considers the assumptions used in measuring the affordability of the local government pension scheme as a public sector pension. But other things have been a bit more practical and a bit more real world, if you like. So some of it's been looking at the pensions pay gap. So we'll all be familiar with the gender pay gap, but actually sort of taking that a step further and thinking about the pensions pay gap. And that's of particular interest to the academy sector, given that our LGPS membership in most academy trusts will be predominantly female. And that works really in its infancy, but is starting to look at what additional data we might need to be able to analyse that, and how we might take it further, and how potentially it differs between pension funds. We've also looked at some data on how the cost of living crisis might have impacted on pension take-up, and whether more members are taking advantage of the 50/50 scheme. So the 50/50 scheme is a scheme that, as the name suggests, allows members to pay half the contributions for half the benefits. And obviously the idea behind that is it's more affordable for potential members who otherwise wouldn't be part of the pension scheme. The committee's also talked about McLeod. So this is the judgment to do with the introduction of the career average scheme and some retrospective changes that need to be made in order to make sure that no member is disadvantaged, or that a group of members is not disadvantaged as a result of the introduction of the career average scheme. I'd say a common thread of the work of the discussions at the subcommittee is around the consistency between the 77 funds that make up local government pension scheme, and just how the data can vary and how we might improve that. The other thing I was going to say is that one element of my work has actually been directly relevant to academies in terms of the establishment of a working group. And that working group is developing guidance in terms of methods of determining the opening share of liabilities. So when a school converts to an academy, how do you work out what share of liabilities for the transferring staff should be attributable to the academy trust? And actually we've also had some discussions about shares of surpluses, which might be the case now perhaps more than it was previously because of some of the underlying assumptions. This guidance is in its infancy, and we carry on working on it, but it's about not giving options as such, but helping the sector to understand what is being done and helping academy trusts to feel better able to understand and challenge their pension funds. It's also important that the actuaries understand that common terminology really matters, and that if you're working across a different number of schemes, you know, different actuaries call things different things, and we're trying to encourage actuaries to come up with a kind of common terminology. I'll hand over to Richard, who can talk about the work of his subcommittee.
Yeah, thanks, Charity. Good afternoon, colleagues. So I was selected to represent academies on the Scheme Advisory Board's Investment, Governance and Engagement Committee. The main issues the committee have been discussing in the last few months are cost transparency, responsible investment, climate change reporting and Sharia compliance. On cost transparency, in aggregate, the 77 funds spend about 1 billion on investment management fees each year. This sounds like a lot, but as a percentage of the 350 billion fund assets, it's less than half a percentage point. Historically, it's been difficult for stakeholders to find out about fees, compare them and ensure that they represent good values. So the Scheme Advisory Board launched a Code of Transparency in 2017, which sets standards for fee reporting. 150 investment managers have signed up, and about 40% of investments are now covered by the code. Most funds require bidding managers to be signed up to the code. The Scheme Advisory Board commissioned software for fund managers and funds to use for fee reporting, and further refinements are currently being made to this product. So moving on to the second area the committee looks at, or has been looking at lately, funds are increasingly favouring responsible investment products that select investments on environmental, social or governance grounds. This can conflict with their fiduciary duty to achieve the best returns for the fund. So the Scheme Advisory Board has recognised that funds need guidance in this area, but unfortunately it hasn't been able to issue advice so far because the legal position is still quite uncertain about how the balance can be struck between the fiduciary duty and ESG objectives. So then moving on to the next item, the next area, climate change reporting. The Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities recently consulted on requirements for schemes to report on their carbon footprint in response to the Paris targets and recommendations of a body called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The new requirements are due to come into effect on the 1st of April, although the regulations haven't actually yet been published. The Scheme Advisory Board has been surveying funds to find out if they're ready to meet the proposed requirements. The main problem seems to be that there isn't really still a single standard accepted and reliable approach to climate reporting. And then the final area the committee have been looking at is Sharia compliance. So some Muslim staff are opting out of the scheme because of concerns that it doesn't comply with Sharia investment principles restricting lending for interest. It's obviously not good for a significant group of staff to be excluded from the scheme and may even represent a breach of equality law. The Scheme Advisory Board is seeking advice from lawyers and Sharia investment experts on this, which might result in changes to the scheme or possibly a separate Sharia compliant fund. So we've included on the slide here some links to websites where you can find more information on the Scheme Advisory Board, and also some of the key documents that your fund is required to produce. Funding strategy statement there, that's the one that Jamie mentioned earlier. There's no need to note these down as the slides are going to be available afterwards. And the next slide we're moving on to now is about two topical issues. I can see quite a lot of questions touching on them as well in the questions: pooling arrangements and the latest triennial valuation. So I've just got a few things to say about those issues. So on pooling, first of all, one important decision that trusts will face is whether to pool. Pooling is when two or more employers or schools share actuarial assumptions and risks and consequently have the same contribution rates and a consistent share of a pension deficit. It's possible to pool schools within a multi-academy trust, or you can pool your school or your MAT with the local authority. Your LGPS fund should have a policy on academy trusts and pooling, and it will probably be part of that funding strategy statement. This statement may not be in the public domain, so you might need to ask to see it. The advantages of pooling with the local authority are that your contribution rate should be stable and also insulated from one-off expensive events such as ill health retirements. This can be particularly important for a small academy trust whose contributions could otherwise be very volatile. However, pooling with the local authority could also mean that your contribution rates are higher than they would be if you are unpooled. This might be the case, for instance, if you have a different age profile. The other thing to be aware of is that you may be able to unpool from your local authority without losing protection from an expensive ill health retirement by taking out insurance. My local authority have just introduced an insurance scheme of this sort. The main advantage of pooling within your MAT is that it simplifies things administratively, as we've heard. Payroll will only need to deal with one contribution rate. A disadvantage is that it might not seem fair when your schools have a very different demographic or deficit history. If you're considering pooling or unpooling or transferring members between schemes to consolidate, you might need to take independent actuarial advice, and this can be expensive. I've heard of a couple of cases where it's cost tens of thousands in fees in order to consolidate members into one scheme from more than one. If it's a relatively straightforward decision, then you may be able to rely on advice from the fund's own actuary, although bear in mind that this might not be completely independent. Moving on then to the triennial valuation. So LGPS regulations, as was mentioned earlier, require funds to carry out these 3 yearly valuations, and the March 2022 valuation process is just concluding. You should have received a report from your fund stating the result of the valuation, including the funding level percentage and proposed contributions for the next 3 years. I was slightly alarmed seeing the poll that 22% of people didn't know what their contribution levels were going to be, even though it's 1st of April is coming rapidly approaching, so that was slightly worrying. You will have primary contribution rates, which cover the liabilities being built up for active members, and if you're in deficit, there will probably be secondary contributions which pay off that deficit over a number of years, as Ross was mentioning earlier. There's a legal requirement the new contribution rates are agreed by the 31st of March, So if you haven't signed them off yet, then your fund really should be chasing you for the agreement to those new rates. The contributions proposed by the scheme actuary can be challenged, although it's a bit late to be doing that for this valuation. However, for future reference, you can challenge on the basis of affordability for the Academy Trust or on the basis of the calculations. If you're in deficit, then you will have been asked to make a secondary contribution to pay off that deficit. This is sometimes a cash sum, or it can be a percentage calculated to recover a share of the deficit over a number of years. The years used this time will probably be 3 years less than the years used last time, which is the approach the Government Actuaries Department have directed. However, it's important to make sure that you're not being required to pay off a deficit over a shorter period than the local authority. As Jamie was mentioning, the DFE's guarantee means that your covenant or creditworthiness is just as good as the local authorities, so you should be given the same amount of time to pay off that deficit. Following the triennial valuation, the Government Actuaries Department, who oversee public sector pension schemes, carries out what is called a Section 13 assessment, in which they look at the condition of the scheme overall and compare valuation methods and results across the country. In their last Section 13 assessment following the 2019 valuation, which is available online to look at, they recommended that there should be greater consistency in the approach to handling academy conversions. It'll be interesting to see if they comment on this when they report on the 2022 valuation. It's worth making the point that given the current economic conditions and relatively healthy state of funds, now may be a good time to make a decision to pool or unpool or to consolidate membership from several funds into a single fund, where the contributions are lowest or the administration easiest. So moving on to the next slide.
So just to touch on what Rich has just been saying in terms of triennial and just to sort of highlight the routine triennial cycle. So rates will have just been determined for the next 3 years and hopefully notified to you. But the process soon starts again for the next cycle. And I think there was just sort of a couple of things really to draw out of that. One is your fund should have engaged with you as part of this time's triennial valuation, and if they haven't held an event or you don't think they've briefed you well enough, now might be the moment, perhaps using local academy networks to help support you to drive change for next time. So I certainly know that there's a variation in approach between the local authorities that we work with. The other thing I'd say is that you might want to have a think about data quality. Particularly if you've got an external payroll provider who provides data to your pension fund, and just how can you be assured about that data quality. I mean, one fairly simple example is if you transpose a member's date of birth, you'll end up paying higher contributions. If you say someone was born in 1976 instead of 1967, the actuary assumes that they'll be alive for longer, and therefore the pension in payment will be for a longer period, and therefore your contributions will be higher. So there are just some practical things that you can think about ready for next triennial. Jamie, I think you're going to handle the bottom half of this slide.
Thanks, Charity. Yeah, so the bottom half of this slide is something we've used internally with colleagues. I think we're just going to quickly run through here, which we call sort of the life cycle of an academy or an academy trust. From the point of conversion, I think some of the bits I might touch on here have been asked as questions, so hopefully I can clarify some of the questions that are coming up at the same time. So a school converts to academy status, and evaluation is undertaken of the assets and liabilities at the point of conversion. And I think we do get some feedback from some schools and academies querying why the contribution rates go up, and that's generally to do with how the assets and liabilities are split. So the historic ones for deferred and retired members would typically in most of the ways stay with the local authority, so that's a mature profile, whereas the new academy would take on the active members, which is a much younger profile. As Charity mentioned, the age of and the relative age of the active members within that. So that is largely what drives the difference to explain that. And as Richard was talking about, the guarantee, is all about assuring the creditworthiness, if you like to use Richard's term, of the Academy Trust in respect of the speed at which the secondary contribution rate, which addresses the deficit, is paid off. So I think we get a few questions. The guarantee exists, but why is my rate different from the main term? So it's something to be aware of. And I think we've had a couple of cases where Academy Trust have had a nasty shock when they've taken on a maintained schools converted, and there's been a bit of a jump in the rate. So it's I suppose advice to just understand, have a conversation with the pension fund about the implications and the likely rate of the transfer. And the second column there is relating to academies transferring to another MAT. So this is what I describe as pick and drop. So the members, active and deferred, belonging to that academy that's transferred, will be moved to the new Academy Trust. It's potential at that point to consider whether it would be pooling would be appropriate, and to have a chat with the fund about what's feasible there. I think in the chat it's come up, can we pool across funds, which the answer would be no. You can pool within funds but not across funds. If the Academy Trust wanted to seek to move all of their academies to the same fund, that would be what would be classed as a consolidation. So that is feasible or possible, but a request would need to be made to the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, who is the policy owner of LGPS. Typically a consultation would have to take place between the different funds and those impacted. So it's a more involved, complicated process and pooling arrangements, and as Richard touched on, there are actuarial costs to transfer without that. So it's not a decision that Academy Trust may take lightly. In terms of the academy sector as a whole, I think it's fair to say the academy sector wasn't designed, or LGPS wasn't designed with the academy sector in mind, and we're sort of working with those parameters. So I think consolidation would be something that would touch on that, and we're looking at that. And I would hope that we're going to come on to talk about the sector working groups that we're seeking to establish with sector representatives. And I think this sort of area is an area we may wish to pick up as part of that. So if that is appropriate for an academy trust, the academy sector as a whole, how we can streamline that to make it less painful as an option, if that is what is the best option. So I think it's something that we'll seek to move on to and explore those types of things. And within that, I think we'd also be looking to establish some, and I think Richard will touch on this in a bit, some good practice guides to help colleagues that work in the sector to understand what the options are, the steps they have to go through as well. And I think pooling and consolidation may be two of the ones we look at sooner rather than later to help trusts and academies. And then moving on to the third column there, school closure. I've seen this pop up in the chat as well as a question. Does the guarantee cover academy closure when the trust continues? The answer is no. So the academy's guarantee only covers when the whole trust closes, and therefore there's a liability left paying, and the department will meet those payments. I think to date, since the academy guarantees come in, the department is funded approximately £20 million of those cessation liabilities, and it's that cost which we underpin the guarantee that ensures that the deficit recovery period is the same as maintained schools as well. So where an academy closes, that would be classed as a cessation event, and that's an impact for an academy trust where that may be the academy's only presence in that particular fund, and that would be classed as a crystallisation event, and there may be a liability owing if there's a deficit on that fund, which again, we've had a couple of cases where we've seen that's been a nasty shock for the academy trust, and they weren't expecting that. So it's the guarantee only kicks in where the academy trust closes, so that wouldn't cover that liability, but there are options available to academies at that point, and they could seek to transfer the liabilities to another fund that that the academy trust operates in. So it's something to be aware of where decisions are being made to close academies. There is likely to be an LGPS impact, and to make decisions around closure on the basis of that LGPS impact. And then I've sort of already touched on this as well. So the in-trust closure, which would be a trigger point for the guarantee, any liabilities that be left unpaid would be met by under the guarantee. And again, just to give the assurance to those funds that they won't go unpaid, and enables them to recognise the full strength of the guarantee to ensure that the contribution rates and deficit recovery rates are set as they are for local authorities. Oh, sorry, it's still me. I'm when someone else start talking, but we've got another poll now. So it's on the topic we've just been discussing. So it's just to get an idea of whether your Academy Trust pools, you don't pool, you do pool, and just to get an idea of that status, just to inform a bit of policy development we might look at. So I think in my virtual horse race, we've got a clear front runner at the moment, which is we do not pool. And I think from our perspective, that's what we generally see when we're looking at the valuation, the triennial valuation reports. Most academies don't currently pool. So I think we're settling down there to a pretty conclusive result. It's just shy of 50% don't pool, 18% do pool. Our fund, or 7% our fund as an academy pool, which should be all academies pooled into that particular fund. And then we have 12% funded with, actually pooled with local authorities. Should we move on there, Ross?
So I think it's me. So this slide is about developments in the representation of the sector's interests in the LGPS, and includes news about a new working group that will be drawing up a best practice guide for academy trusts, among other things. If you've got any suggestions for themes or topics that this guide should include, I think there'd be loads of suggestions actually already in the chat. But if you've got any more, do please put them in the chat, and we will we'll look at the most popular ones when we meet. So as was explained earlier, the sector was invited to nominate 2 reps to sit on the Scheme Advisory Board's main committees last summer. In addition to Charity and myself, a dozen people put their names forward for this, and they were from a range of academy trusts, and a reference group was formed of most of those who applied. We've held several meetings timed around the Scheme Advisory Board committees so that Charity and I could consult on the issues that were coming up and also discuss colleagues' concerns. We've also engaged with the Confederation of School Trusts to help give us a wider sector perspective. And then a couple of months ago, it was suggested that we reconstitute this reference group as a more formal Department for Education working group. So following consultation with the reference group and the Academy's Finance and Assurance Steering Group, which oversees the DFE working groups, this was agreed. So we think there are a number of advantages in converting the reference group to working group 4 from the point of view of the sector. The working group structure provides us with support with running meetings, and also provides access to central government departments where some of the key decisions are made. This has the potential to increase our influence. Although representation on the Scheme Advisory Board committees is a step forward, there are limits to the changes we can bring about through the Scheme Advisory Board, and working more closely with the ESFA team should help get our voices heard. It's also clear that there is an overlap between the issues the ESFA team are interested in and our main priorities, which include concerns about valuations at conversion and transfer, and over complex admin for MATs spanning different local authority areas. Both parties are also keen to raise awareness of the LGPS in academy trusts so that trusts are better informed customers, better able to take advantage of options that exist, which could help with balancing school budgets. As chair and vice chair of working group 4, Charity and I will also join the Academy's Finance and Assurance Steering Group. This should help ensure that there is join up with the various projects the working groups are involved in, and that pension issues get the attention they deserve. I'll hand over to Jamie now, who's going to say a bit more about this from the ESFA team's point of view.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so it's important for us, and I think I mentioned this before, that if we distill down what we're trying to do, whether that's the department, ESFA, or the sector itself, it's about ensuring most money can be directed to the classroom for the teaching of kids. Is what we're all here for. So I think in terms of the work that Richard and Charlie and what we're seeking to do in terms of operational policy, it made sense that we came together and worked much more closely and collaboratively. And I think from our perspective, it's really good that we can bear in mind and keep focused on the end user of any guidance we may put or any operational policy we may seek to implement. So it's very good in terms of keeping in touch with the sector itself to understand the problems and to be able to find solutions for those that work for academy trusts and academies. So therefore the feedback from Charity, Richard and the group would be particularly important to that as well. And we've touched on some of those issues and whether they be pooling or consolidation or what we might do there, and particularly useful to make sure any messages we put out, whether that's guidance or the policy, is actually worded in such a way that's understandable. And I think getting the feedback there particularly, and I think as Richard's touched on there, whilst colleagues on the reference group have got a voice now, there's only so far that goes, and there's certainly as we as a government department interact with Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which owns the policy around LGPS, the Local Government Association, the Government Actuaries Department, which oversees all public sector pensions, and the scheme actuaries and the funds. So I think in terms of how we interact in the stakeholders that operate in the LGPS and the academy sector, we complement the different workings there. So particularly useful coming together to make sure we're getting the right policy that we're seeking to establish working group 4. There are 3 other working groups which in some ways I'm sure we touched on all of the work you do. Working group 1 looks at the Academy Trust Handbook. Working group 2 looks at finance returns that the ESFA asks academies to complete, and working group 3 looks at the Academy's accounts direction in terms of that, so, and the various policies that fall out of those as well. So we very much see the establishment of a working group 4 working along the same lines as those existing working groups, to make sure that the academy sector is heard and we can influence the overarching policy, but also operational policy and the guidance and how that would work. And then talking about, for example, pooling or consolidation as well, to make sure we have access to the right data to make informed decisions as well. So whether we can commission reports, we'll be seeking to do that if that's appropriate, to make sure it's evidence-based policy creation and implementation as well, which is certainly an important point. So I think we've come to an end of our formal presentation now, so we're going to seek to pick up some of the Q&A, and I can see as I've been talking, lots of questions, really good questions have come in, and some suggestions as well. So we're going to try and pick up some of those and just read through some of the answers that have been provided. Really positive. We've had lots of people on the call today asking lots of very pertinent questions, and we're going to try and get through as many as we can. If we can't manage to get through all of those, we'll seek to wrap those up if feasible, and put out some sort of Q&A just to make sure that we're touching on all of the questions that are asked if we can't move on to those. So I'm sure my colleagues will keep me right if I've missed anything here, but so quickly looking through some of the questions that have been asked and the answers provided. So I'm just going to quickly go through. How can our LGPS scheme announce that we are fully funded but our academies rate is still going up? The answer to that would be the individual employer position can differ from the total fund position. Each employer has their own assets and liabilities assigned to them. So it really depends on the demographic profile of your membership, which can impact that. So we've talked about the local government pension scheme guarantee. So there's guidance and what that exactly means, and that's published on gov.uk, and there's a link in the chat, I believe, on that. So question, can Academy Trust offer an equivalent alternative to LGPS? As we touched on, I think at the start of the conversation, Academy Trust must offer LGPS to eligible employees at all times while they're employed by the Academy Trust. So that really dictates that it has to be offered as an option legally. Question here, we span multiple local authorities. Can we merge our funds with one local authority? And I think I mentioned earlier that is a possibility and Trust can explore that. But as Richard mentioned, there are costs associated with that in terms of the consolidation and the actuarial valuations as well. So it's something to be mindful of. I think that if I was offered a little bit of advice, we're looking at this as an area, and I mentioned the working group might look at this. So it might be one to watch this space on that. Because I think if we did see a significant amount of consolidation, we would like and I hope to see a more streamlined process if that is the right thing to do. So we're looking at various different areas, I think, on that. So it might be one you want to wait and see what happens in the policy space on that. A question on the guarantee, but I think we've picked that one up already. Is the local government pension scheme required to publish all the contribution rates paid by the scheme members? And if yes, where are these published? There's no legal requirement, but it's best practice for all funds to publish contribution rates. The majority of funds do this through the Scheme Advisory Board, and there's a link in the slide deck to where they're all published. I know personally I've scanned through those as well, and I generally always find the rates of different academies and the local authority and all of the employers in the scheme. Another question about the DFE guarantee. Would you therefore expect the employer rate for an academy in a local authority to be the same rate as for the local authority? I think we've touched on this one before. No, the individual employer contribution rates are based on employers' funds. So the guarantee enables funds to recognise the funding strategy. So it's a document that Richard mentioned, and it's applicable to maintain schools. So that relates to the speed at which the deficit is paid off, rather than the contribution rate that is linked, the primary contribution rate that's linked to the profile of your staff and the contributions that need to be made for that. Can the ESFA advise on what happens when Academy Trust merge and those staff aged 55 or over who can't be assimilated into the role of a large trust and be made redundant? Who does the liability for redundancies and the capital cost of pensions required to pensionable age? Not all trust CEOs, for example, are in the pension scheme. The pension strain for those aged 55, subject to reorganising, can be very high indeed. It's an area that will be reviewed, especially as the normal pension age has increased. So that's something as a requirement of the scheme, that the eligibility to enhancements for those members that have attained the age of 55 is mandatory, unlike, for example, the teachers' pension scheme where it's discretionary. But typically speaking, where an academy trust or an academy closes and merges with another academy trust, the liabilities would be picked and dropped into the new cost. So it would typically be met the liabilities from the funds available for either the academy or the trust that is joining. Just an addendum to that, I think it's as I mentioned, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities own the overall policy for LGPS. So in terms of whether that should be access for the automatic right for those aged over 55 would be picked up as part of any review of scheme rules, rather than the operational policy that that we would seek to look at from the department's perspective. Across the scheme, staff choose to opt out due to the cost of living challenges. There may be more not affordable or more affordable options for staff. And I think, as Charity mentioned, this is part of her section, the scheme offers a 50-50 options, allows members to reduce their contributions and receive a reduced pension. And this helps support members, however, employers are still required to pay the full rate. There's more information about that on the LGPS website. Quick question on pooling across different funds. So I think I touched on this. You can't pull across different funds. You'd have to apply to a transfer and consolidate all your academies into one fund. That would be the only way to do that. But again, to refer to my previous comments, it's potentially costly to do that. But it's something we'll potentially be looking at. So it's maybe watch this space. I'm just going to pause as we're reading through them. And colleagues, my colleagues on the call, are any further questions that I might have missed that we need to flag up? Please do shout up.
Thank you, Jamie. I think we've actually come to the end of time, so thank you for the questions you've already answered. And I think it's already been mentioned that we might try and pull some sort of similar themed topic questions and maybe send them out at a later date. I'd like to thank you all for attending this session. It seems a really popular one, and also thank you for all the presenters for giving their time to put this on. We're really appreciative of that.